A couple things, just a reminder on this week and also next week, we're into material about really the end of the 24 hours of Jesus' life that can feel a little intense for the young ones. So make those decisions as you need to as parents. I will never say anything that's too graphic, but it's enough to maybe have to think about. Also, that Monday, Thursday service is probably not great for the youngest children, only because it's very somber, it's slow, and it's a traditional service. So it's, choir, and it's just different than what we usually do. It's really, really powerful and really intense as well. So keep that in mind when you're planning on Monday, Thursday. I hope you're there, because it is really a big and powerful service. Okay, well, this week, I don't know if you heard about this or if you were tracking along, but on Bill Maher's podcast, he had Alan Ritchson, who's the big hulking actor who plays Reacher on Amazon Prime. You're welcome, Amazon Prime. They're not paying me to say that. And he is also a very devout and outspoken Christian. And he was on Bill Maher's podcast. And Bill Maher, if you don't know much about him, he is a very out front atheist. But I will say he's also not afraid, doesn't seem to be afraid to have spiritual conversations. So he has this conversation with Alan Ritchson this week. And Alan, he did an amazing job, I thought, keeping a very winsome and smart and informed Christian faith in the face of some pretty, some arrows that were coming his way. I thought he did a really nice job with that. But one of the things Bill Maher said was something I actually wanted to tease out here, because I feel like it's prevalent in our society. It's prevalent in our culture. And that is, he said at some point, he said, Jesus' biography isn't all that original. In fact, it was stolen. And what he's saying is, and this is definitely big among atheist circles or non-believing circles, is that, the whole story of Jesus is lifted from Egyptian mythology. So in some stories of like Horus or Mithras or Osiris, he talked specifically about Osiris in this one, that, there's dying and rising, and there's, wise men visiting a baby, and there's all these parallels, as if to say Jesus' story is just another iteration of the same thing from Egyptian mythology. And literally, and I don't mean to tease, but all you have to do is open a book to see that that's not true. It literally is. This was debunked decades ago. In fact, Frankfurt wrote in 1961, he did a deep dive onto this, Kingship and the Gods, a study of ancient Near Eastern religion and the integration of society and nature. And he was talking about Osiris. He said Osiris, in fact, was not a quote-unquote dying god at all, but a dead god. He never returned among the living. He was always depicted as a mummy, a dead king. The story of Osiris is his wife, like he was dismembered and his wife put him back together. I mean, what an anniversary gift. What do you get her after that? Anyway. And then he sort of descended to the realm of the dead. It's not exactly the same thing as resurrected and paying for the sins of humanity. Like, it's just, these parallels are overblown. But then I started asking myself, why do I hear this a lot? Why does this keep coming up? Why do these sorts of claims keep coming up? Every Easter, there's some special on the lost gospel of Thomas or the lost gospel of Mary. Somehow, the church has suppressed these gospels that should have been included in the pantheon of Scripture. And there's some scandal, like the church is hiding something. No. The reason that the Gospel of Thomas, for example, is not included is because it was written 150 years after Jesus. It was never included because it was never seen as authoritative. It was not written or even close to being in touch with eyewitnesses of the accounts. They were all dead. So that's why it was never included, because it wasn't considered authoritative from the beginning. There was no suppression happening. It's just, it was too late to really be trustworthy. But why does this keep happening? Why does stuff like this come up all the time? I think, and see if you agree with me on this, I think it's because it makes it less threatening to believe. If I believe Jesus is kind of a nice idea that was blown out of proportion, I could keep him over here in my life. I don't really have to pay attention. But if Jesus is the one who died and rose again for my sins, if Jesus is the one that he claims to be, then there's actually a call upon my life. And I need to pay attention. I need to follow. And that's not very comfortable. I'm much more comfortable with the idea of Jesus being a sideshow than the main event. I think what happens is there's this sense of, oh man, if I really do a deep dive on this and I discover that Jesus is Lord, what does that mean for how I'm living my life? I don't like that. I don't want anyone to tell me what to do. I want to do what I want to do. And then I think about this, and I think about how the last week of Jesus' life transpired. You can make a pretty good argument that the people who were there on Palm Sunday, which we celebrate next week, but the people who were there on Palm Sunday really believed he was the Messiah. We have some evidence that they believed this. It was the way that they treated him coming into town. You don't just do what they did for anybody. It was something you did for kings. They gave him the palms and psalms treatment. Right? So they would raise palms as a sign of honor. They would also lay some of the branches on the ground or their own cloaks on the ground. The idea that the king is unfit to touch the ground, so he walks upon the cloaks or the palms. They were shouting Psalm 118, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. They were saying Hosanna, which means literally save us now. They believed he was the king. And it's why we see kind of throughout, when we talked about this last week, Pontius Pilate's interaction, he kept referring to him as King of the Jews. Because they thought he was the king. And I was thinking, wow, what a transformation in 1 week. I got to think some of the same crowd members were there. What happened? We'll get to that. Just to review where we've been so far quickly is Jesus, we had him reinterpreting the Passover to not just be about the old covenant, but the new covenant, about him being broken, his blood poured out on the altar for many. We had him in the Garden of Gethsemane as he's praying to his Father, asking to take this cup from him. Not my will, but yours be done. He is arrested and betrayed. Everybody scatters. He stands trial before the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, to which they sentence him to death, but they can't do that on their own. They need Roman authority to do that, so they go to Pontius Pilate and convince him that he needs to sentence Jesus to death. And he says to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said so," Jesus replied. He calls to the crowd. He said, What shall we do then with the one you call, O crowd, King of the Jews? You called him that. You called him the King of the Jews. You acted like he was King of the Jews last week when he came into town. What should I do with this one that you call King of the Jews? Crucify him, they shouted. And wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. Nope. Back one. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. And this is the part of Jesus' story that I have a hard time personally facing. I want to read past this one really quickly. I watched The Passion of the Christ once. I didn't want to do it again. It felt too real. And yet, I know that there's also an important piece of facing it so that I understand exactly what he laid down for me. I'm only going to give a couple of details. If you want to research this more, there is more in that book, 24 Hours That Changed the World, and certainly elsewhere. But to be flogged by the Roman Empire was no little thing. They were really good at torture because they thought it had a deterring effect. You're going to commit a crime? Think again. You're going to go against the empire? Think again. And so what would happen when somebody was flogged and this is what happened to Jesus, is first of all, they were humiliated. They were stripped naked, hands tied, bent over, and hands tied around a post. So it was completely humiliating. And so everybody could see the scourging that would happen on their body. 2 or more lictors would inflict the punishment. And their weapon of choice was a flagrum, which is pictured here. A flagrum had a simple handle, and it had leather pieces that came off of this handle, and they would attach pieces of bone, glass, metal, rocks, anything they could do, because it was designed to rip the skin. And the idea is that once you beat a prisoner so badly with this, exposing their body, it would be just enough to where they wished for death, but they were still alive enough to carry their cross to their own death. It was horrific physical torture. And you just can't escape the fact that he actually chose to lay down his life in this way. At any time, he could have stopped it. So let's watch how this unfolds. This is Mark 15:16. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. By the way, in the garrison, and you'll see a picture of the garrison in a moment, there would have been, it was by the temple, there would have been some maybe 300 to 600 Roman soldiers. It said they called the whole company of soldiers. So likely there were hundreds of soldiers there around Jesus. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. Of course, what are they doing? They're having a mock coronation. And I'm sure you've seen pictures of the crown of thorns with thorns, this big, and what that would do to have that slammed on your head and twisted. And they began to call to him, "Hail, King of the Jews," of course, mocking him and his real identity. Again and again, they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And every single time I'm reading this passage, or however each of the Gospels presents it, not only do I get incredibly sad, but I feel the outrage of it's not fair. Why did he take this for me, for us? Of all people, why did he have to do it? And I know up here why he had to do it, but I feel it here. And then there was the humiliation, right? So it wasn't just the physical torture, it was the humiliation. They were humiliating him as he was beaten. And I wonder, and this gets teased out in the book as well, I wonder if it's because Jesus didn't do what someone getting tortured would do. He didn't beg for mercy. He didn't ask them to stop. He just took it. And I wonder if that infuriated them. I wonder if that made them want to mock him more, to try to get to him. Remember, these were professional torturers. I don't know what sort of person you have to have that as your job, but I imagine you're not right in the head. His reaction wasn't satisfying to them, so they held a mock coronation. And it's just a reminder of not just the physical, but the emotional torture that he must have faced. Even so much, at one point they offer him, this is in verse 23, they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Wine mixed with myrrh would have been like a natural painkiller. He didn't take it. This is a display of Jesus' love like maybe in no other place. He went to the cross for love, and love is what kept him there. He could have stopped it at any moment, but he wanted to do this for you, for me, for us. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. Obviously, a prisoner who's been beaten this badly, then they have to carry their cross, which most likely would have been just the horizontal cross beam. The vertical beam, most likely, is what scholars believe, would have already been in position where he was going to get crucified. This made it easier for the people doing the dirty work, that part was already done. But that crossbeam was no joke. 85 to 100 pounds, perhaps, after you had been flogged and in this condition, and carrying it about a quarter mile from where the torture happened to Golgotha, or the place where he was crucified. So they recruit this guy from out of town who's probably there for the Passover festival. And you often wonder, like carrying Jesus' cross, I think that might leave a mark on you. Even not knowing what we know now. To gaze into his face in this moment, I imagine, would be with you the rest of your life. And I'm very optimistic about what happens with Simon of Cyrene. I believe he became a believer, and I think it's in between the lines that you discover this. How do they know so much about this guy? How do I know that he was the father of Alexander and Rufus? It seems like maybe he and his family were part of the following Jesus community later, that they would know so much about this out-of-towner. Perhaps. But either way, he's forced to carry the cross because Jesus can't. Jesus physically can't. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. This is where crucifixions happened. And it was right outside the city walls. So there's a map here that I think is pretty helpful. Just to orient you, the temple is here. This is that garrison I was talking about of Roman soldiers called Antonia Fortress. And this is Golgotha. So these are the original walls, and the idea was it was right outside the walls of the city, and when you were coming in to the city, you would see the crucified as a warning and as shame. And this is what we do to people that don't fall in line. So, Antonia Fortress, there's a wonderful 3D model that somebody made of Old Jerusalem, and they have pictures of this model. It's in Jerusalem, or it's in Israel. And it's really cool how they kind of recreated it. But that's what it would have looked like. It was right next to the Temple Mount. And then Golgotha, where he was crucified, today is where Church of the Holy Sepulchre sits. And that's what it looks like on the outside. And on the inside of that is a shrine where you can go and worship. And many pilgrims go there every year to worship the place where Jesus died. Also, the pathway that Jesus would have taken from where he was tortured to Golgotha is commemorated and marked out by the Via Dolorosa in Israel, in Jerusalem. And so you can actually follow this path, and it's sort of like winding through streets of Jerusalem to follow the path that Jesus took. And some of you know this, maybe you've been there and you've experienced that for yourself. But either way, 3/4 of a mile to carry your cross, and Simon carrying it with him. You're just reminded of what he went through. In this section of Scripture, here's a question that keeps coming back to me. If this is much of the same crowd who's there, now I know the crowd's not the one torturing him or mocking him, King of the Jews, but they were the ones shouting, "Crucify him." when they were just singing, "Save us now, Hosanna in the highest." I have to think a lot of the same people were involved. Maybe not all of them. But what happened? Within a week, we go from royal welcome to royal mockery. Covered with cloaks to the road being covered with his own blood. Psalms of praise turned into insults and mockery. Shouts of "save us" turn into "crucify him" and "save yourself" as they yell to him as he's hanging on the cross. You came to save us, save yourself. So the question is, what happened? I've been sitting in this scripture all week. So it's been a heavy week, feeling this, as I'm sure you're experiencing hearing this. So I wanted to think of a story that would make a point, and it's intentionally lighthearted. Karen and I, we were working in a group home, and it was very early in our marriage, and we had 6 teenage girls that were in between the justice system and getting back home for all different reasons. Some of them would come, they'd stay for a couple of weeks, some would stay for months, some stayed for us our entire time that we were there, about a year and a half, about 2 years. And there was often drama, as you can imagine, in the group home that, Karen and I didn't know what to do. We did our best. We were too young. It was tough. It was really challenging. The girls would often fight each other. You had to always be looking for drug problems and all this other stuff. But there were often fights of one kind or another. Either they're arguing with us or they're arguing with each other or whatever. So this sets the stage. I'm away for a week. And I come driving up to the group home house. And there were some girls out in front that were kind of pretending to argue with each other. And then there were some that were pretending to sort of wrestle, like WWE. No, not that bad. Not that bad. But, and then one of them, and when I pull up in the car, and then one of them comes, "We don't know where Karen went." I'm like, "What do you mean you don't know where Karen went? So you guys are here by yourself and you're all fighting? Like, what is going on?" And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, who am I going to call? I got to call Karen, and what's going on?" And they're just like, "Yeah." And I don't remember what they said. They were telling me this whole story of everything that went down and this huge drama that was happening. And I'm ready to have a heart attack. And I'm like, what do I do? I don't know. Who do I call? And then all of a sudden, Karen and everyone pops out and they go, "Gotcha." I was so mad. They got me all right. Yeah, just like the WWE, it was a total act. Years later, after therapy, I thought it was funny. No, it was very funny. But I remember that feeling of being so upset and oh my gosh, how can you do that? That was a really tough one to take. And I promise it ties into what I think is going on with the crowd. You've heard a lot maybe just about not just inflation, but skimflation, right? I'm telling you, there's less chips in the bag, and they're charging me the same price. People are outraged over this. Maybe you are too, I don't know. It's to do with expectations and reality. How do you feel like if you've been tricked or you've been fooled? Or the expectation that you have is let down by the reality? You feel disappointment. You might feel anger. You might feel resentment. Here's what I think. Maybe the people during that week, maybe they thought they'd been fooled. Maybe the Jesus they were expecting is not the Jesus that they got, and they were outraged. Crucify him. He's not what we were hoping. Why? What were they hoping? Well, if you look at the Old Testament, you understand kings in the Old Testament is how they were looking at it. They were expecting full-on Lord of the Rings king, Return of the King, coming in on the horse and achieving victory. A warrior king who was going to conquer the Roman Empire, put them in their place finally, Finally, we're going to be saved, and justice is going to be had, and all is going to be made right. Hosanna, save us now. And maybe they thought they'd been fooled because now they see Jesus coming in on a donkey, a sign of peace. They see him tried and tortured and eventually crucified. And they think this is not the Messiah we were expecting. We're not going to get justice after all. Of course, little do they know, the justice is going to be far greater and infinitely bigger than they could have possibly imagined. Maybe that's why Paul points out in 1 Corinthians, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. A couple verses later, he says, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. Maybe they felt they've been fooled. Maybe they felt let down by the Jesus they got versus the Jesus they expected. And maybe that's exactly where this hits you this morning. Maybe you feel in a similar way. Maybe you have some disappointment or anger that Jesus didn't do what you expected him to do. Hey, I started going to church again. I was expecting him to do something about this problem I keep praying about. I was expecting him to fix this thing in my life. Or I was expecting him to not allow this thing to happen in my life. Maybe I've been fooled. Maybe this Jesus isn't the Jesus I thought he was. Maybe you've been carrying with this with you for a while. You afraid that you've been fooled? If you are, I want to encourage you to keep digging through that. Go down another layer. Because what you're going to discover there is bigger than you imagined. Yes, in this world we do have suffering. We do experience pain. After all, the Messiah, come on, he wasn't supposed to end up on a cross. Don't worry, he didn't stay there. Because the reality is infinitely more powerful than the expectation. You want justice? You kind of don't, by the way. You don't want what you deserve. Jesus conquered reality itself. What he did was bigger than any of the things in our lives. He made a way for us to be one with the Father, to have everlasting life in communion with him. That we would be made whole, that we would experience the peace of Jesus Christ. I'm so amazed whenever I've had loved ones in my life who have gone through significant sickness and even death, even when they're at the point right before they die, to express that they are feeling at peace because Jesus is with them. That doesn't make any sense. Why? It's because of what he did on the cross. In this life, you're never going to experience the level of joy and fulfillment that you find in Jesus. When you put your trust in him, when you realize he's exactly who he said he was. He didn't just go to the cross. He went to the cross for you. For you. He didn't just take those wounds. He took them for you. The humiliation for you. Why? So that in judgment, when God looks at you, he sees the righteousness of his Son, Jesus Christ. You are the forgiven ones, the children of God. But it's not free. It came at a terrible cost. But it's freely given out of his great love for us. You know what I think? I think the last 24 hours of Jesus' life We don't see the foolishness of Christ, but the foolishness of humanity on display. Even as he hung there, he's whispering forgiveness to the people that put him there. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. You want to know the real hoax? The real lie? Is that the world convinced so many that Jesus isn't the Messiah. That's the real prank. And maybe because that feels less threatening. Is it, though? I think what's worse is never knowing Jesus at all. I would never wish that on anybody, which is my life is dedicated to sharing him with the world. I hope yours is too. I don't think the real triumphal entry was when he came into Jerusalem that day. I think the real triumphal entry is when he marched to the cross. Because it was there that not just his humanness, but his power was on display. What do I mean? How is that a sign of power? Because Jesus was never once a victim. He says it himself. He laid down his life. That takes some power. He didn't just die and rise again. He died and rose again for you. So I'm going to ask you this. I've been asking it every week in this series. 24 hours changed the world. Has it changed yours? Do you realize and will you embrace what he laid down so that you don't have to? The love he so freely gives so that you can receive it and give it to everyone else. I hope so. Amen.